Hey everyone, welcome back to the 443 Security Simplified. I'm your host, Mark LaLiberty, and joining me today is...
Ori Cold Knockreiner. I'm a bit sniffly and coughy, so I'll try to mute myself, but excuse me in the background with the sniffles.
Caught the DEF CON bug. On today's episode, we'll go over 4 more in total of our favorite presentations from Black Hat and DEF CON, which happened last week. We'll give you a bit of a summary of what happened and some key takeaways for you. If you want to see more Black Hat, or I guess more DEF CON talks, definitely check out media.defcon.org for those. But with that, let's go ahead and hack our way in again.
Phone in.
Freaking.
Rotary dial in.
So let's start with, now that we are back home, mostly safe and sound from Hacker Summer Camp.
Some of us are back home. You ran
That's
off
a good
immediately
point.
to a new thing.
I am at least in the same state as home right now, even if I'm a couple hours away at another thing. But overall, like, I thought this year was pretty great in terms of both Black Hat and DEF CON. I don't know about you, Corey, but I felt like the talks at Black Hat were actually more valuable and less businessy than I'm used to. I think DEF CON, the change of venue this year, did wonders for just making it easier to get to more stuff that I wanted to do.
Absolutely agree. The Vegas Conference Center, I think they have over 1 million square miles. And unlike where we were at last time, do they call them the forum shops? Like, there wasn't line con getting from place to place, just pushing through halls of 20-some thousand people. There were like probably 30,000 people at DEF CON, but it was nice and open. There's a huge arena for the villages. So the villages were wide open and could even decorate and have cool. I don't know if you looked at the AI arena, which looked like a whole art institution. So yeah, it was cool. It was definitely much easier to get places and kind of a return to community. Although speaking for myself, I might have caught a con cold because of that community.
The community gave back to you, I see.
Yeah, for sure.
The villages part was my favorite because last year, so DEF CON was held at Paris and Bally's? No, the Caesars Forums. But then they had the villages, which are like, think of it like a little indie mini con for a specific topic. But they were spread out over like 5 different hotels. So like getting from the main discussion tracks to like a village, it was like an hour round trip of walking to get there and back, which meant I didn't get to go do a whole lot and visit a whole lot. And this year in comparison, like spent like half the day on Saturday hanging out in the blue team village, listening to some like indie discussions there, popped into the red team village for a bit. And I felt like I learned a lot from those smaller format talks that I otherwise probably would not have been able to do. So this year was pretty good. But so I guess for time's sake, Corey, you and I each picked out a couple of our favorite discussions that, well, I don't know. I have no idea what you picked, but I picked a few that I think actually have a decent impact for our industry as a whole that I was going to go through. Mine are, I guess, both from DEF CON. There are still plenty of Black Hat ones that I thought were interesting, but these I think really took the cake. And so I guess like for time's sake, let's jump in and I'm going to steal the floor first. And the first talk that I thought was really interesting was called Breaking Secure Web Gateways, or SWGs, for Fun and Profit. It was by Vivek Ramchandran and Jeswin Mathai of SquareX. And so it was all about research around secure web gateways that basically advertise malware and phishing protection for users. Corey, do you want to give like the business description of a secure web gateway, and for any of our partners or listeners that maybe haven't played with them before?
I guess there are some that are like, you can either consider, I've heard enterprise security gateway. A remote browser could be one example of a secure gateway where you're browsing from somewhere else through a proxy, but it could just be a network appliance that either acts as a standalone secure web gateway, or you could even probably consider some of the services on the Firebox acting like a secure web gateway. So basically it will somehow inspect or proxy your connection to the web. It's supposed to do malware protection. So anything you're touching when you go to the web, it's supposed to block any malware from being downloaded. But it should also prevent you from any other malicious websites, like whether that be phishing, whether that be sites that have evil JavaScript that might render in your browser and do something bad, like a drive-by download. So essentially just something that's trying to secure your users' browser sessions as they're going
Yeah.
out. And they're dedicated ones, or I consider a lot of the functionality we have in our UTM to be secure web gateway functionality.
And it is also still a big part of like the SASE corpus of different security controls too, where if you've got a cloud managed one that can give you a secure internet access while providing security services, it was a bit of a mix between that and some like traditional on-prem systems like you were discussing too. But their research was all about like these secure web gateways. They advertise protecting your users from malware or phishing websites. Well, what are some ways where I, as an attacker, can get around those protections? And they started with the obvious ones. Like all of these services have restrictions on like the biggest file that they will scan for malware. And some of them, that was as low as 2 megabytes, meaning they won't scan a file past the first 2 megabytes. And so if you've got, like, most malware is way smaller than that, but if you've got a larger malware payload where the actual malicious code is later on, that would get through. They also pointed out that all these services have a specific list of file types that they will scan, mostly around like executable programs and some scripting. But for example, some of them didn't even scan like Office documents. But that's not what the talk was about. Those are the obvious ones that are potential weaknesses. Instead of focusing on that, though, they focused on a class of attack that they call last mile reassembly, which is ways to sneak a file or a phishing page onto an endpoint by smuggling it through some other different protocol or evasion technique and then rebuilding it locally. So from the end user's perspective, it all looks like they went to a website and a file downloaded, like through the same mechanisms of the browser, or they went to a website and a phish popped up. But in reality, the attackers are abusing different ways to get that to actually work. So, for example, one of their attack paths was through unmonitored channels. So your web browser, it supports way more than just HTTP and HTTPS. There's WebRTC, there's Firebase cloud messaging, there's WebTorrent as a protocol. And if you use these different ports, they're all still handled within the browser, but they are typically not inspected by secure web gateways. So maybe the page is downloaded through HTTP or hopefully HTTPS. It then does a file download through WebTorrent or WebRTC. The browser still shows it as that, little file download in the top, and it looks all normal to the end user, but it just evaded all of your
using a different
controls.
Protocol behind the scenes. Yeah,
exactly.
Unless somehow you have a real security gateway that's somehow parsing web torrents, which is not trivial.
Protocol agnostic. Yeah, most of these vendors will recommend you just block those protocols, but that can make some web pages less easy to use or straight up broken. Yeah. Second one they went was using WebAssembly. So WebAssembly is like a compiled web application that's used by mobile games primarily, but some other services too. So in one of their attacks, they created a malware payload, compiled it into a WebAssembly file, a WASM file, delivered it to the endpoint. Because it was in this compiled program, the secure web gateway didn't scan anything. And then they just used JavaScript in the browser to unpack that payload and trigger a file download locally. So from the end user's perspective, looks like they just downloaded a file, it got past the secure web gateway. It must be great. Go ahead and execute it. Another one is plays off of like an older style of attack. So this one was, they called it file chunking, where you break up that file into a bunch of smaller pieces, maybe like rearrange them in their delivery or even reverse the binary inside of it, and then use JavaScript again in the browser to piece them all back together and turn them back into the actual file, and then trigger a local download to make it look like it was downloaded across the net. Because some of these secure web gateways don't do like full reassembly of file downloads, and they might miss that. Encryption and encoding were other ones where if you encrypt the file up in the cloud and then use JavaScript locally to decrypt it, that can get it past secure web gateways that are strictly looking for a file download header, a content disposition header. They would miss those. But one that was really interesting for me was less about malware delivery and more about phishing delivery. where they were using MHTML archives. So MHTML, it's if you ever go to a website and like save the website locally on your machine, it'll save the website HTML file, all the CSS scripting, the JavaScript, images, all of that locally in this kind of archive called an MHTML file. And they found that you can trigger a download for that and then use JavaScript to unpack it and basically rebuild the web page locally. The analogy they use really stuck to me where imagine like you've got a painting that's like illegal or something for whatever reason. Instead of shipping the painting through security, you ship the painter through security and have them repaint it on the other side. And that's basically an analogy for what's happening there, where instead of shipping the phishing website through the secure web gateway, you ship the capabilities to recreate it locally once it's past those controls. Because a lot of SWGs rely on like fingerprinting the code of the site. That's how they can catch it if it pops up at a different domain almost instantaneously. But if it's built when it's already past the security tool, a secure web gateway has no way of seeing the actual content of that page without some sort of like browser extension on the endpoint. So all of these were really interesting ways to evade. They were focusing on like SASE based secure web gateways, but like you said, this is all applicable to like network security appliances as well too, and where potentially having a more restrictive outbound policy and blocking some of these more risky protocols might be a good control for you to have to reduce the opportunity for one of these attacks succeeding. I thought it was pretty cool.
Yeah, we already talked about this one-on-one, but the one thing I think about, especially for malware, but I guess you'll talk about how phishing might be different. This is where I would assume endpoint security, or even I think they were selling browser security specifically. So maybe you can talk about the difference there. But endpoint security, we love network security. We love endpoint security. We think both can see things the other can't, and both can miss things based on their technology. But in this case, for at least the malware, the crux of the issue is all the encoding that happens that your network device isn't ready to parse. So yeah, you can have something that's scanning for malware, however it's coming down over, like in the normal ways things come over the web. But if it's using all kinds of weird encodings and protocols, you may not be able to catch it if it's encrypted even. But at the end of the day, it has to decrypt at the browser in order to actually be useful to you as a user. So is endpoint security a viable solution to some of these, or were there limitations too?
100% for the malware-based threats, endpoint security would hopefully catch that threat then, because the end result of all this is regardless of how like the data for the file is delivered to the endpoint and jumbled up and unjumbled, it still ends up as a file download in the web browser for something saved onto your hard drive. And so endpoint would catch that and hopefully block the malicious code. But phishing is a little different.
And the phishing, yeah, anything that runs in the context of the web browser may not necessarily.
Exactly.
And phishing especially sites would just, they render.
Yeah. Yep. Especially if they spin up a brand new domain for this, like domain-based protections wouldn't catch it. Typically, endpoint protection won't fingerprint the website like HTML. They might notice like malicious JavaScript and be able to block a phish that way, but it would make it a little more possible for a phishing website to end up on an endpoint if it can get past these network controls. Overall, cool talk, but I guess, Corey, if you want to pick one of yours to chat about next?
Yeah. I promised I would talk about a Black Hat thing, but to stay on theme, I'll start with DEF CON first. And you did something kind of useful and business oriented. I'll go straight to like nostalgies. I went to a talk on day 2 called Cult of the Dead Cow and Friends Present Prime Cuts of Hacker History, 40 years of 31137 or Elite. And, you know, the main part of this was bringing a lot of 80s, 90s hackers back to talk about stories, because now we're talking to like a Gen Z crowd even of hackers that, and they may not know what a rotary phone is or what IRC is even, which seems crazy to me. So it was just an excuse really to talk about kind of the granddads of hacking. But for me, you know, I turned 50 this year, and the Cult of the Dead Cow turned 40 just recently. So it was really an excuse for a bunch of them to get together and tell cool stories. So for an old guy like me, one, it was a super popular talk. It was a packed room. This was on the third floor, which what did they call it, Mark? It
The
was
war
where
stories.
the war stories. The theme of this track. This was a main talk track, but they had all kinds of different war stories, and there was lots of good stuff in that particular track room. But they
The one
had
about
folks like,
the guy that befriended the
yeah,
lockbit
yeah.
ransomware operator was insane. That was
Neither of
such a
us
good
were going to
story.
share it, but I was definitely going to call out that one, the Lockbit Day Behind Enemy Lines. Joe DiMaggio, who's kind of he used to like, he is a pen tester, but also a journalist and author. So his story was amazing. And there's even a guy that I don't know if you went to this one, the XZ Utils backstory one, where Thomas Rokia, who's a French person from Australia, not the original guy Andreas that found it, but someone that worked with him went over that. So a lot of good backstories. But this was a bunch of big hackers. So people like Emmanuel Goldstein, who isn't part of the cult of the dead cow, but is the guy that's founded 2600. I would presume most of our readers have listened to 2600. But like Frack and some other zines, otherwise known as e-zines, it was really the first hacker. Started as a text file magazine, but eventually got printed. He was there. Death Veggie was the main guy from CDC. Patrick Krupa, who was part of Mindvox and Lord Digital. Tommy D. Cat, a well-known phreaker. And John Threat, who was one of the guys that never attended the cons. A lot of these old, like he was the black guy from New York, a well-known hacker, but he was much more black hat. He was breaking in machines while everyone was going to cons. But it's hard to describe this talk other than a lot of history of stories. It lasted an hour and 45 minutes and then went 2 hours with questions. I actually had to leave to get to another talk, but they talked about the Legion of Doom and the Cult of the Dead Cow. If you don't know, the Cult of the Dead Cow is like one of the first big hacker groups. It actually started near where you are now. I mean, in the same state as you, Mark, in Lubbock, Texas, in 1984, and
I
it was
understand the cow reference now.
the other part of the cow reference is they found an abandoned slaughterhouse. Basically, their hangout is a bunch of they talked about how culture and hacking kind of came together during the time. I was a skater in the 80s and 90s, not necessarily a good one, but they were just skater kids who talked about their origin stories and talked about things like Commodore 64, Sinclair's Z80s, and of course they had modems like me. Every single one shared a very common origin story. Obviously, gamer hacker skaters, they found a slaughterhouse that was abandoned in Lubbock, Texas, and that was their little hangout, kind of like the Hackers movie, although that was in New York, obviously. Um, I don't know if anyone remembers Backorphus. They didn't talk about this a lot in the talk, but it was one of the first pieces of freely available malware or remote access Trojans. And I remember it having the coffee holder functionality, which means it would pop out your CD tray. Anyways, they told a lot of stories, basically talking about everything from freaking the you've heard, our audience has heard your and I's story where I always talk about the $400 phone bill I got with my 300 baud modem that my dad, and that was what got me into freaking. Not every single one, but three of them mentioned the same huge phone bill story, and that is how they started figuring out how to freak. Uh, they talked about the thirst of knowledge. They dropped all kinds of undergrounds and BBSs. I remember like Metal Shop AE, I should say. A lot of people may not know of these, but if you were around during the time, you could see a bunch of old people like me in the crowd kind of nodding their heads as they talked about even things like BitNet, which I was never part of, but BitNet was a chat program that preceded IRC, and one of the guys made some of the first BitNet bots, which eventually turned into IRC and IRC bots. So I took so many notes and stories in this, it's hard to pick one. But at the end of the day, they were just telling cool stories for old guys. And I thought it was also fun to kind of see them describe things that, Generation Z hackers probably have no clue about. Um, so I don't know. There's so many stories. I don't want to pick one. I will say uh, they even kind of subtly outed the one guy Johnny, who was the black hat hacker. Eventually, Mindvox had their email list hacked and taken down, And Johnny had, or I'm sorry, the Mindvox guy had some sort of post saying, "I'm going to go after whoever did this." And John eventually asked him if you ever found the guy, and he said no. But then he posted a text file that was basically a private email from Mindvox, and it turned out he was the one that hacked. So he is kind of flexing that, "Hey, dude, I hacked you." So it was funny just seeing them interact with each other, and it was
That's
a bunch of
good.
good stories. Yeah. There's a ton of other things. I have so many notes. I'm having trouble finding the right ones to pick. But they talked about things like SummerCon and PartyCon, which were before DEF CON. So it was just interesting seeing all these old guys talk about hacking when it was not a common thing at all. I also
Did
didn't
they
realize that Jeff Moss founded HackerCon, which was before DEF CON, one of the conferences they all went to back in the 90s.
did they have any thoughts on like how hacker culture has grown or changed entirely over the last 20, 30 years? Because it's very different now than it was back then,
The
right?
guy I found most interesting is every single one of these guys had the same kind of white privileged uh, origin story where it was, all of them were middle class. They had a computer. All of them wanted to play games. So they mostly started understanding how to crack things because of copy protection. But the one interesting guy was John Threat, because he was an urban kid in New York, a black guy, and apparently he found way back in the 80s, he mentioned a person named Sheila, lovely woman named Sheila with a mohawk, who was a teacher at a place he lived by and invited him to her house to code. And he said, "No games, just code." And he was very kind of anti this gray hat or white hat concept of all these, privileged wares kids turning into the good guys. He wants to break into computers. He was bragging about, breaking in and owning things. So to me, there was no comment on how hacker culture has changed, but I feel like even at DEF CON, hacker culture has gone kind of, yes, sometimes you have the gray hat in it, but it's mostly about security and doing ethically okay things. He was screwed that hacker culture is rebelling. Hacker culture is fighting back, is owning computers for power. So I just found him very, very interesting for sure. They also talked about stories about there was an insider. I had it up a second ago before I scrolled, but they had some insider that actually started, that was a hacker but got caught and then started narking on some of these folks, like the Cult of the Dead Cow folks, to the FBI. But Johnny also had a different view on him, because even though he was a narc and an insider, he never narked on Johnny Threat. Anyways, it
Uh-huh.
was just fun. They told so many good stories. The main thing is, rather than hearing me babble about it, you should go check out the YouTube video, especially if you're a 40 something or 50 something security person. I think you'll find it fun. I think every person in that room of my age just saw themselves in one of the personalities up there and the starts, and just had a lot of memories. And if you're just starting off in security, it was such an easy day, and things were not as secure, but things were also very obscure. Everything was new when it came to technology. So check out the talk, listen to the YouTube video. I think you'll like it.
It doesn't look like it's up yet, but by the way, all the DEF CON talks are on media.defcon.org, and that is every single one dating back 32 years. They always upload the presentations there if you're
And they're
interested.
free, unlike Black Hat, where you have to pay actually a huge amount of money to get the videos offline. They give it all out free.
Yep. So I'll take the reins next. The next one I went to was super cool from a technical standpoint. It was like a good mix of hardware hacking and like software hacking, which kind of spoke to me and my history of going after IoT devices. So this one was called "Watchers Being Watched: Exploiting the Surveillance System and Its Supply Chain," and it was. I'm so sorry to all of these three gentlemen about what I'm about to do to their names. But it was Vishin Kim, Myongyoung Pak, and Myongjin Shin. So three researchers from South Korea, where they started with the premise that networked video recorders, or NVR systems, are often exposed to the internet. They actually showed some Shodan searches with like hundreds of thousands of these devices connected directly to the internet. They focused on two industry leaders, so Hikvision and Dahua, which are both commonly OEM'd under a whole bunch of different names too. They had a list of like a couple dozen NVR systems that were ultimately one of these two. And so they started off their talk with like a video setting up like what their goal was, where I don't know how real this was or if it was staged or something, but they showed a surveillance video of someone they claimed was in Iran. And it was a security officer watching a screen of video screens in front of him. And you're watching kind of from behind their shoulder from a camera that's watching them. So it was to show the premise of you've gained control of the system, you can see the camera, and then you execute the exploits they're about to talk to. And basically, one by one, each of these video screens shuts off and gets changed to like effectively a ransomware, like, haha, you've been pwned kind of message. But so they walked through like their steps of finding a whole bunch of vulnerabilities on these different systems. It started with how they needed to gain access to the firmware. They had UART access and even SSH access in some cases, but it was highly restricted. They had to use a electronic glitch during boot to basically cause the firmware to fail loading at a certain point, which had it fall back in the to the U-boot shell, which gave them basically bootloader access on here. Even then, though, the file system was always mounted as read-only, so they couldn't like modify it to gain access to it. They found they ended up using what's called a blind mount, where basically specifically for etc passwd, they were able to mount that as read-write. The rest of the file system would get mounted as read-only, but that more specific one would still stay there, which then let them modify the passwords after boot, which then let them access it through SSH with a known credential. Through that access, they then found the default credential for SSH access, and it was pretty garbage. They probably could have brute forced their way in. But long story short, they ultimately got access to the file system, which then let them analyze it and look for vulnerabilities. And they went through, I think, 4 different completely separate exploit chains that resulted in some form of remote code execution on the server and letting them either gain control of the video feeds or like block out the admin from accessing it. And like, so a few examples, like one of them, they found that there's an API you can use to interact with this device. It's less of a, like data API and more of a management API that the front end web server uses behind the scenes to do stuff. They found that it checked for authentication, but it did not check for authorization. So even with just a guest user account to this, you could go in and gain full admin access to it pretty easily. In another example, they found the authentication token. You had a bunch of different ways to authenticate. And for each of the ways, you had to pass a parameter called the authority type. It was basically saying, this is a, say, API key. This is a username and password. This is something or something else. They found a bug where if you set that authority type to just null, it just let you log right straight into the machine. And then from there, they found ways to gain a root shell, ways to reflash the firmware. They had another example where they found the network configuration, so turning on the network interfaces. There was a 5-second gap between that and loading up the user accounts. And so through a series of exploits, they would trigger a reboot on the device through a overexposed API, time it, so wait for the network config to come online, trigger a memory corruption issue, which then broke loading the firmware right before it would load the users. So instead of loading the actual users, it would go into a initialization mode and let you reset the user passwords to log in. And then through that access, they could reflash the firmware or just totally pwn the device. In one of their exploit chains, they were able to basically gain access to the video file and then block the actual admin from accessing into the video files, like overwriting their screen with, haha, you've been pwned. It was all like super interesting. And it was like a couple 100,000 devices are exposed to the internet that are vulnerable to one or more of these exploit chains. So I liked it because this is the type of research that if I had more free time, hands-on time, I would be probably doing more of because it's so dang interesting. And it's one that's like a prolific issue, like hundreds of thousands of vulnerable devices directly.
So many of these devices, and you can pick one and find so many vulnerabilities in one of these so many devices. So it just seems like a rich attack surface for sure.
Exactly. And they talked about like, sometimes it's not even Your goal isn't to own the NVR to see the video. Your goal is to own the NVR to gain a bastion host on that network to then go
Yeah.
and attack everything else on it.
Although both could be fun, right? I mean, you could even, I agree with you. I think the point of IoT is not necessarily the device itself, just that internal host that gives you elevated privilege internally. But with a video system in particular, if you're doing any sort of physical attack, owning that IoT device could actually have benefits on other types of crime.
Exactly.
Yeah, cool.
So super interesting. I guess, Corey, you got one more to go over?
Yeah, I mean, there were a ton of other Black Hats ones. Like, I really wish I could talk about the XY details. That guy released a lot more technical information about the flaw, including correcting a few things from journalists. But I do want to go back to Black Hat. And this is a Black Hat talk that I think it's okay to talk about because I didn't watch it at DEF CON, but this is one of the Black Hat talks that was on a main track in DEF CON as well, and it was called Living Off Microsoft Copilot by Michael Bargery, who's part of a company called Zenity. And really, the whole part, the main point of the talk was talking about how he could do at the end of the day, a remote hack that he compared to RCE, remote code execution, through Copilot. So I think everyone knows that Copilot is kind of Microsoft's artificial intelligence or machine learning, whatever you want to call it, assistant that connects through everything Microsoft. Like, it can have access to your entire M365. It can have access to something called your enterprise graph, which is information from all those M365 productivity and file sharing tools, including things like Teams. So, he starts with the way he really started his presentation was actually a video demo. And in the video demo, you see a victim, so someone presumably that's part of an organization, use Copilot, basically ask Copilot in Teams or something for account details for a particular financial account in order to do something. And you see, the detail of that local tenant giving an answer of where, what the account is and the information the person needed. And that's all well and good because this person was high up in the part of the organization, and it was a quick way for him to find a financial account he needed. But then you see an email, or you see the video continues where that same victim gets an email. By the way, it just shows the email arriving in M365. The victim doesn't even have to look at it or open it. An email just comes to the victim. Then the victim asks the exact same Copilot question in the same way, asking for the account detail for something he's doing. And this time you see Copilot generally give the same response, but there is a new account there, a new account number there, allegedly an account number belonging to the actor, including some other links. So that video is what he shows first before he even goes in the talk. So the question is, how did this email that arrived suddenly cause the internal local tenant of Copilot, his presumption was this was a paid Copilot, give this fraudulent account information that presumably if a victim uses would lose money. And that was what the talk was all about. Like, the speaker, Michael, started talking about, how Copilot's supposed to act, how Microsoft describes it as this protected and well-secured thing. He talked about how with the paid professional Copilot, you do get your own tenant. And, you're supposed to only have Copilot data coming. Your Copilot data shouldn't get out, and people shouldn't be able to manipulate your tenant in Copilot. But his talk goes through, and so he starts by telling you that. He also shows a number of things that Copilot does to protect itself from things like prompt injection or other data leaks. For instance, if you ask Copilot a bad question like "What is my name?" It's or "What is so and so's name?" and maybe you're an attacker, Copilot will deflect that question because it knows it shouldn't be giving out personal information. But if you do a normal injection attack, or you do an attack that starts with, "Hey, let's be polite," and being polite includes addressing people by name, and I want you to respond to all my questions in a polite manner, Copilot will start using your name back to you to be polite. So, for instance, if you hacked into someone's account, you don't know who they are, but you could use Copilot to do that. So that's one example of how Copilot's designed to deflect answers that might give up certain information. And he went through a number of different ways that Copilot is supposed to protect itself. And it was all because he was going to show you how you could abuse it at the end. The one key part of his message too was we're also worried about data leakage. Like we have this our own tenant if we pay for Copilot, and we're worried about making sure none of our data leaks out past our own employees. But he says the real problem is jailbreaks, which is essentially bad guys getting Copilot to do something it can't, and eventually doing it, remotely. Another example he gave, by the way, was something like list all the employees and their social security numbers. And in that case, Copilot won't deflect. It will simply say, no, I can't. That's against I can't do that. And that's all because Copilot has things like sensitive label inheritance, where, right, using Word or Excel or any of the Microsoft products, you can put things like the protection icon for sensitive things like financial documents. And if there's that sensitivity label, Copilot's going to use them to decide who can, like, if you say list all employees' social security numbers, you're not in a list of people that are get that particular Excel spreadsheet. It's not going to share that data with you. But the one thing he kept on mentioning is all of these protection mechanisms aren't equal everywhere. For instance, Teams does not have sensitive labels. You put them in Word and Excel, but people sometimes copy and paste this data in Teams. And when you have this corporate graph, everything that happens in Teams and every other Microsoft app becomes where Copilot goes for information. So anyways, he started with that video, and he basically said to do this hack, let's say we want to hack Copilot remotely. We need a way in, we need a jailbreak, and we need a way out. The reason the way out is important is one of the protections is Copilot does not have internet access. Its internet access is essentially limited to what Bing knows. It can't go to the web. It will not paste normal URLs. It will not use images, but it can get data from what Bing would return on the internet. So basically, his talk was going through those three things: a way in, a jailbreak, and a way out. And the first thing he mentioned was that enterprise graph, the fact that Teams is also a place where Copilot looks for information, not just Word documents and Excel documents would be protected. And he starts right away by saying, even if you have a paid for Copilot in your own Copilot tenant, Teams allows you to send messages to another tenant. Depending on your settings, you can by default, you can send a Teams message to anyone that has Microsoft Teams. Now, as you know, Mark, every enterprise might have their own properties on what to limit to and from guests, whether, maybe you don't allow files, maybe you don't allow guests at all, but that's very rare. In most cases, you can at least send a Teams message or emails to other Microsoft folks. So he mentioned if you do research on Teams-based phishing, there's so many ways you can do Teams-based phishing. So to him, Teams was a way in because say a very common query someone might ask Copilot, like if like something like account information, or maybe someone asks Copilot, where is my organization's Power Platform Admin Center? If you think about something a normal employee would ask of the Copilot of their organization, if you can send Teams messages to a guest, the one thing Teams doesn't know is the difference between a guest person in your enterprise graph and you. So if I can get any messages or any content to your Teams through these guest messages, Copilot's suddenly using all of that data from its enterprise graph to formulate its response to any sort of queries.
Okay.
So if you know the subject someone's going to query, and you're able to send messages through Teams, or later on he talks about it's even email. Teams will use everything in M365, and that's why that email, even before a user's responded to it or even opened it, the second it hits your O365 tenant, it becomes something that Copilot starts looking at for its response. And the funny thing about Copilot is it looks at text. It doesn't look at all the metadata. So for instance, when it looks at email, it will see the recipient's name as a person, but it pays no attention to their email address. So all the things we use to recognize, this person's inside the company, coming from watchguard.com domain versus outside the company, Teams is not paying attention to that stuff. So long story short, Teams and email turns out to be ways where you can plant information in, say, the training data or the response data that Copilot is using. So, and you can get tricky with that. He mentioned jailbreaking can be simple things like what I described to you, human language, where if it's not going to tell you your own name, you can do things like say be polite, and being polite is using our names, and then it will. But there's more technical jailbreaks than that involve all kinds of codes that are important to co-pilots and links. So he mentioned discord.gg dash BASI or front slash BASI as a jailbreaking group that has all kinds of technical ways you can jailbreak Copilot. But what he could do is send a very specialized message around a subject. And the subject, for instance, if it were the finance case, he would send stuff in his email or Teams response that had very specific words about financial accounts and stuff. But then he would hide instructions in various HTML tags and other things in the email. And the point is, if he can get enough, or the attacker can get enough information that's based on some sort of query, an employee is probably going to ask Copilot eventually, your response can be the one, you can force a Copilot to have a very specific response to that. And
So
that
it's
response,
it's a
go ahead.
modern
Yeah.
version of SEO poisoning, like where you're trying to get your malicious
It
Google
would be
thing.
very similar to SEO poisoning, but using non HTML tags are used like SEO poisoning, but the way you have to do this jailbreaking and injection into the returned response is very detailed. Like, he didn't
Yeah.
share all the details for that, but he referenced it's because it's been researched before. If you go to discord.gg.basi, you can find it all. So he shared all that, and essentially at the end of the day, he could even get some of the references to go to an evil Nginx phishing server that was under the attacker's control too.
Man.
So there's so much information. I mean, he showed a lot of attacks. The way he described it was plain English. He didn't go into like, he would show screenshots that had the very specific HTML tags, but you'd have to screenshot them or go to, discord.gg/BASI to figure out more. But it was a very cool attack that at the end of the day, just by being an external person sending email or Teams messages as a guest to someone else's tenant, you could control how Copilot would respond to very specific things. And in controlling how it could get to very specific things, you could also find a way out where it would return data to the attacker. So it
That's
was,
scary.
or not only return data, but literally phish and hack them. Basically, it was kind of English-based SQL injection to your enterprise graph.
Right.
Like, think of the enterprise graph as all the data that's part of your organization through Microsoft apps.
Yep.
He was adding malicious documents and malicious information to your enterprise graph because Copilot doesn't really care. Copilot is looking at everything in your tenant, and it's not really paying any attention to the metadata that tells if it comes from the outside or inside.
So maybe main takeaway is just slow down, pump the brakes on using Copilot for now, until there's a bit more.
He said
control.
that first, AI is awesome. Like definitely use it and get to know it. But he said, think about it like experimental drugs. And it's experimental drugs that are a clinical trial, right? And there could be a very positive effect to experimental drugs. Like, if you have a disease and you're dying, and this drug is one that might cure you, huge positive potential. But it's experimental. It's a clinical trial. Bad things can happen too. It's not tested enough. So it was, like you say, use at your own your own risk.
Analogy.
And there's no free lunch. He says also that more data equals more instructions. Like, Microsoft is sucking data, and that Copilot is sucking data from everywhere to do its job. So yeah, beware the devil you know.
Damn. Well, that was just 4 talks out of like 400 from the last week. And I guess we a bit out of time for more. I definitely recommend checking out media.defcon.org for all the video recordings. There are some pretty dang cool ones in there. There's way more on that media server as well too, including stories and art and things like that. But that's one more Hacker Summer Camp in the books, Corey. And I guess now it's 364-ish days until the next one. It does feel, well, It'll feel good to be home tomorrow. But
for sure. I hope you get home soon. I'm happy to be home, especially feeling under the weather.
I'm looking forward to digging through the other DEF CON talks that I wasn't able to attend because I've not figured out how to be in two places at once yet.
Teleportation. And they'll have that too.
Exactly. Hey everyone, thanks again for listening. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. If you have any questions on today's topics or suggestions for future episode topics, you can reach out to us on Instagram at watchguard_technologies. Thanks again for listening, and you will hear from us next week.